Imagine waiting until your son's wife's birthday to drop a legal bomb on your own child. That is exactly what King Charles III did. He waited until Meghan Markle's 45th birthday to execute a legal move that permanently changed everything for the House of Windsor. And honestly, the level of planning here is either terrifying or impressive, depending on which side of the family you are looking at. Because while everyone was watching the Duchess of Sussex cut a cake in California and debating whether her lifestyle brand launch was delayed again, the actual machinery of the monarchy was executing something that makes all the memoir drama and Netflix specials look like playground stuff. This isn't about who said what to whom, or whether someone made someone else cry before a wedding. This is about a king sitting at Sandringham with a fountain pen, systematically rewriting the entire financial and legal architecture of the royal family to permanently wall off anyone who doesn't live in Britain. And the really wild part is that he did it using an emergency constitutional provision that basically nobody outside a very small circle of palace lawyers even knew still existed. So let's start with what actually happened, because the details matter here and the timeline is genuinely bonkers. In early August 2026, while the global media was fully occupied with the Duchess of Sussex's birthday coverage and all the usual speculation about whether the royal family would acknowledge it publicly, King Charles was at Sandringham executing something called a codicil. Now, I had to look this up because it sounds like a pasta dish, but it is actually an emergency legal mechanism that allows the sovereign to unilaterally restructure non-crown assets without going through parliament or cabinet approval. Think of it as the legal equivalent of pulling a fire alarm that locks every door in the building at once. It is designed for situations where the monarch determines there is an institutional crisis that can't wait for the normal, slow process. And Charles decided that August 2026 qualified. The timing wasn't accidental. Choosing a window when the news cycle was already saturated with birthday coverage meant the legal filing would land with a thud instead of a bang. Nobody was watching the court circular. Nobody was monitoring trust filings. Everyone was looking at California, which is exactly where the palace wanted their attention directed. What the codicil actually does is where this gets genuinely fascinating from a legal strategy perspective, because Charles didn't just cut off access to money. He rebuilt the entire inheritance framework around a single devastating clause. Any beneficiary who maintains primary residency outside the British Isles for 5 consecutive years is now automatically disqualified from accessing the core capital principle of the trust established back in 1994. That 5-year threshold is not random. It aligns perfectly with Prince Harry's withdrawal from active royal duties in 2020. By the time this legal document was signed, Harry had been living in California for roughly 6 years. The math is precise. The cutoff is retroactive in effect, even if it is technically forward-looking in language. And the really clever part, if you can call it that, when a father is essentially legally disinheriting his son, is that this transforms the whole situation from a family dispute into a matter of objective black-letter law. There is no room for emotional appeal. There is no space for negotiation. There is no phone call that can fix it. The trust either applies to you based on where you live or it doesn't. And if you chose to build a life in California, it doesn't. But Charles didn't stop at the money, which is honestly where this goes from being a financial restructuring to something that starts looking like a comprehensive legal campaign. The codicil also addresses physical property, specifically items that have been designated for decades as eventually belonging to the descendants of Princess Diana. There is one piece in particular that the palace legal team apparently focused on: a diamond and ruby tiara that was originally presented to Diana by a foreign head of state during the 1980s. For years, this was understood within the family to be intended for Harry's future children or grandchildren. Under the new legal framework, the palace reclassified this item as an official diplomatic gift rather than personal property. That distinction matters enormously. A diplomatic gift belongs to the state, not to any individual. It gets housed in the Tower of London collection. It can't be exported, inherited, or used as collateral for private loans. And once something enters the state collection under that classification, getting it back out is essentially impossible. The legal standard for reversing that kind of designation would require proving the original classification was fraudulent, which is not happening when the sovereign himself signed off on it. The archive seizure is maybe even more aggressive, and I say that knowing how wild the tiara reclassification sounds. Within the codicil, there is a specific footnote that addresses personal letters written by Prince Harry during his teenage years at Eton College. These are stored in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Sandringham Library, which is already a sentence that sounds like it belongs in a Gothic novel. But stay with me. The document formally transfers legal copyright of these formative writings directly to the office of the Prince of Wales. Now, under property law, the physical owner of correspondence holds enormous leverage, even if the author retains certain publication rights. What this means in practice is that any future memoir, documentary, or public project that relies on descriptions of early family interactions or quotes from those letters now has to go through William's office for permission. The palace didn't just lock the vault, they locked the intellectual property rights to Harry's own teenage handwriting. That's not a financial decision, that's narrative control, and it's permanent. The non-disclosure mechanism built into the codicil is where the trap really snaps shut. The text explicitly states that any legal challenge brought against this amendment by a disqualified beneficiary will automatically trigger the public release of all private financial audits concerning that beneficiary's post-royal commercial ventures. So here is the dilemma the California household now faces. You can accept the financial restructuring in total silence, lose access to the trust capital permanently, and move on with your life. Or you can challenge it in court, at which point every single business deal, every partnership agreement, every revenue stream from the Netflix deal to the book advance to the speaking engagements gets laid out in public discovery. The palace has essentially written a gag order into property law. You want to fight for the inheritance? Great. The fight itself exposes your entire financial operation. That's not a legal strategy designed to win in court. That's a legal strategy designed to make sure court never happens. It's checkmate written in trust clauses. What makes the timing even more pointed is that while all this was being signed and sealed at Sandringham, Prince William apparently had no idea what was happening until his access to the sovereign registries got cut off. The digital bridge that allows Kensington Palace and Sandringham to coordinate estate management went dark from the northern end. William's office started making calls. Nobody answered. The king was isolated behind closed doors with his legal team, and the Prince of Wales had to make the decision to get in a helicopter and fly to Norfolk without the standard 48 hours of advance notice or security sweep. When he landed in driving rain and tried to access the upper floor of Sandringham, he discovered that his biometric access privileges had been systematically erased from the local system registry within the preceding 2 hours. An administrative warrant issued directly by the keeper of the privy purse under the king's sovereign prerogative had removed him from the entry system. He pressed his thumb against the scanner. Red light, low electronic tone, access denied. Through the glass viewing slit in the reinforced security door, William could see Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, walking down the inner corridor carrying a locked leather dispatch case with a blue customs tag indicating international diplomatic transit. When William knocked sharply on the glass, Alderton held up a signed executive order commanding total operational silence and kept walking. Now I want to pause here because this detail is genuinely staggering when you think about it. The heir to the throne, the future king, was physically locked out of a building he was supposed to inherit while watching the king's staff carry documents past him that would permanently alter the financial structure of the institution he is destined to lead. And the reason he couldn't do anything about it legally is even more remarkable. William had inadvertently signed the mechanism that made this possible 2 years earlier during a routine estate restructuring. There was a cross-lease for a block of land near Highgrove that contained a hidden subclause granting the reigning monarch the permanent right to reallocate an equivalent value of non-land assets during a family restructuring. William signed it without scrutinizing the granular fine print. That standard lease became the exact legal lever Charles needed to execute this massive wealth redistribution without administrative resistance. The Prince of Wales had unknowingly provided his father with the key to lock him out. That's not just irony. That's estate planning conducted at a level of sophistication that most law firms couldn't pull off if you gave them a decade to prepare. The witnessing ceremony itself is worth examining because it reveals just how carefully the palace legal team constructed this to withstand any future challenge. Under British law, a sovereign's private will amendment cannot be witnessed by family members, palace employees, or anyone who stands to benefit from the estate. The witnesses have to be entirely impartial. So the palace brought in Dame Sarah Esplin, a senior High Court judge, Sir John Baker, the Chancellor of the Diocese of Norwich, and Professor David Starkey, a constitutional historian. 3 people with unimpeachable credentials who had no personal stake in the outcome. All 3 had to be physically present in the same room at the same time, observe the king sign the document, and then sign it themselves in his presence to satisfy the Wills Act of 1837. When William entered the room holding a printed copy of the amendments, he demanded an immediate halt, arguing that reallocation of historical heirlooms required a secondary verification certificate from the Victoria and Albert Museum. The High Court judge calmly informed him that the king had already secured that certificate during a private audience in London 3 days prior. Every objection had been anticipated. Every procedural challenge had been neutralized in advance. The signing itself took less than 3 minutes. King Charles entered the room at 20 minutes past 4, leaning on a silver-topped walking cane. He did not look at his son. He walked directly to the reading desk, took his glasses from his pocket, sat down, and dipped his fountain pen into the inkwell. Once he signed his name at the bottom of the third page, the three witnesses signed in rapid succession, each signature accompanied by a physical wax impression from the Sandringham state seal. Not a single word was spoken between father and son. The document was locked inside the leather dispatch case and became an active legal covenant the moment the last witness finished signing. Immediately after, the internal phone system rang with an urgent call from the keeper of the Privy Purse, reporting that the main accounting terminals in London had automatically locked down 3 major overseas investment files containing the liquid capital reserves of the Duchy of Lancaster. By locking these files under a conditional trust amendment, Charles ensured that his successor cannot access core capital without meeting restrictive management conditions drafted by the Norwich legal team. A physical bank statement discovered inside a desk drawer revealed that a massive chunk of private offshore wealth had been transferred into a permanent independent endowment fund, dedicated exclusively to the maintenance and restoration of historical state apartments at Windsor Castle and Holyrood Palace in Scotland. The private wealth is now permanently bound to the physical upkeep of the institution itself. Future monarchs will have guaranteed funding for roof repairs and stone restoration. They will not have liquid capital they can redirect for personal purposes. What rippled through the upper echelons of the British legal establishment in the days following was a quiet recognition that an uncrossable line had been permanently breached. The high-end London law firms that specialize in elite estate management understood immediately what this meant. The palace was no longer attempting to manage internal friction through public relations campaigns or gentle press briefings or temporary tactical adjustments. The House of Windsor had chosen to deploy the absolute and unyielding authority of property law to enforce total structural compliance and absolute operational silence across every branch of the family. Among senior advisors and key members of the royal household, a consensus formed that while the abruptness and secrecy were startling, this was an unavoidable intervention to neutralize persistent instability originating from the California branch. For years, the friction caused by external commercial ventures and public commentary from the younger prince had threatened the long-term stability and dignity of the crown. By choosing to bypass traditional interpersonal negotiations and instead codify strict financial boundaries, Charles provided a definitive template for handling internal crisis. The mindset shifted from viewing this as an emotional family dispute to understanding it as a vital defensive consolidation of sovereign resources. The transformation in how the monarchy manages its internal relationships is now complete. The traditional reliance on spoken understandings and shared family goals has been entirely replaced by formal trust clauses, strict residency thresholds, and immutable property deeds. Senior advisors and constitutional experts observe that the monarchy has chosen to insulate itself from future volatility by making its foundational wealth legally impervious to external pressures. Individual ambitions will no longer be allowed to compromise the financial security or historical continuity of the crown. This systematic approach has also redefined the role of the heir to the throne, positioning the future sovereign as the guardian of a heavily fortified legal architecture rather than the absolute master of a fluid estate. William initially resisted these changes, viewing them as an infringement upon the traditional prerogatives of the next in line. But the wider royal establishment views the outcome through a lens of pragmatic necessity. By locking core capital reserves into dedicated maintenance trusts and imposing rigid accountability measures, Charles has ensured that whoever sits on the throne in the coming decades will do so with a guaranteed institutional foundation. The catch is that foundation comes with handcuffs. The future king inherits a crown equipped with unyielding legal armor, but he also inherits financial parameters he cannot alter. For the California household, the implications are severe and irreversible. The financial safety net that was likely assumed to be an immutable birthright has been subjected to a comprehensive audit, and in the process, the king has installed a permanent trapdoor. The 5-year residency threshold means that even if Harry were to return to the United Kingdom tomorrow and re-establish primary residence, the 6 years already spent abroad have triggered the disqualification. There is no curing period. There is no grace provision. The trust language is absolute, and the non-disclosure mechanism means that any attempt to challenge this legally would expose every commercial venture of the past 5 years to public scrutiny. Every partnership agreement, every revenue projection, every tax filing. The palace has effectively said, accept the new reality in silence or explain your entire business model under oath. That's not a choice most people would want to make. The reclassification of heirlooms adds another layer of permanence. Items that were understood for decades to be destined for Diana's younger son and his children are now state property housed in the Tower of London. The archive copyright transfer means that descriptions of family life from Harry's own teenage perspective are controlled by William's office. The financial trusts that would have provided capital distributions at specific age milestones are now conditioned on geographic requirements that cannot be met from California. Every pathway back to the institutional resources has been systematically closed, not through angry letters or public statements, but through the quiet machinery of property deeds and trust amendments and biometric access restrictions. What Charles has accomplished, viewed through the cold lens of institutional strategy, is a masterclass in preemptive legal defense. He took a period of intense internal volatility and familial fragmentation, and used it as the justification for an emergency constitutional maneuver that will protect the Crown's resources for generations. The era of soft boundaries and emotional compromises within the British monarchy ended on that rainy Tuesday afternoon at Sandringham. The new reality is codified, ironclad, and entirely immune to the emotional whims of the public square. The House of Windsor now operates as a rigid corporation governed by the cold calculus of property law. Future sovereigns will ascend not as masters of a fluid fortune, but as guardians of a heavily fortified legal architecture designed to endure for centuries. The silent acceptance that rippled through the corridors of power in London confirmed that the rules of engagement had been irrevocably rewritten. There's no room for future dissent, no space for emotional appeals, and no mechanism for legal reversal. The path forward for the British monarchy is entirely clear. The institution is no longer at the mercy of personal relationships or shifting family dynamics. It stands protected by an unbreakable legal framework. Sovereign, secure, and entirely self-contained, the era of a soft monarchy is over, and the first casualties of this new order are the very expectations of the family members who sought to operate independently of it.